very grateful for your invitation, and I'm really happy to be here. My lecture will focus on these 4 main points, but more generally, I will try to provide a double point of view about Nietzsche's theory of ressentiment. Not just a terminological, linguistic, textual, philological analysis, which is quite important, as we will see, but also a theoretical and conceptual explanation of the role of this theory in Nietzsche's whole thought. Namely, I will try to summarize what French people call l'enjeu, what is at stake with this theory in the whole philosophy of Nietzsche. So, among all the possible and varied interpretative keys, it strikes me as very useful and appropriate to approach Nietzsche's theory of ressentiment from the point of view of the genealogical method employed in its elaboration, paying special attention to Nietzsche's psychological observations about self-deception and false consciousness. As we will see, Nietzsche's psychological construction of ressentiment stems from crucial contributions from many different sources, such as the psychological science of Nietzsche's time, namely positivist psychiatry, dynamic psychiatry, and Darwinian psychology, the French moralist literature and novel tradition of Montaigne, La Rochefoucauld, Flaubert, Stendhal, etc., and in particular the French translation, as we will see, of Dostoevsky's work, L'Esprit Souterrain, published in 1864, from which Nietzsche borrows the word ressentiment. And then it is important also to consider the Basel Kreis, namely the Circle of Basel, as it is known, as it has been defined from the historian Michael Vorbs, and its approach to ancient Greek thought, which is essential to an understanding of Nietzsche's notion of aristocracy and aristocratic morals, because the pars construens of the theory of ressentiment has to be identified in aristocratic morals, as we will see. And then positivist materialism, influenced by French sensism and neo-Kantian psychology, which allows Nietzsche to emphasize all the physiological and instinctual forces involved in the dynamics of the ressentiment, felt by priests and slaves against the nobles, warriors, the so-called Wohlgeratener, namely, it means people of good birth. Here you have the 3 characters created by Nietzsche in Genealogy of Morals. As the keystone of Nietzsche's deconstruction of morality, the mechanism of ressentiment shows above and beyond external appearances the snares of a universal moralizing law that makes mistrust of the instinct second nature, as the author claims in Ecce Homo, because in Nietzsche's thought, morals themselves are conceived as a symbolic language of the emotions. In German, it's eine Zeichensprache der Affekte. It's a notion I will further explain afterwards. So a symbolic language of the emotions to be analyzed by bringing in philosophy, psychology, and even medicine. Therefore, unlike other recurring literary or even philosophical uses of this term, ressentiment is not, in Nietzsche's view, a simple passing feeling or a restricted event, but rather rises to the rank of a true theoretical system. In other words, ressentiment becomes the root of a particular vision of the world, a real episteme, as the philosopher will call it, with all its 1,000-year lies and its damaging metaphysical misunderstandings or the false moral values marking what goes by the name of décadence, another French term. And against this reversal of values produced by ressentiment, namely the replacement of the instinct for strength and happiness with the blame and guilt attributed to all drives, Nietzsche proclaims the very necessity of a new Umwertung aller Werte, transvaluation of values, of all values. In this perspective, I will highlight the differences between Nietzsche's notion of ressentiment, the common category of resentment in English, and other similar German terms such as Groll or Verstimmung, and so on. Furthermore, we will see that Nietzsche conducts his analysis of ressentiment as a very strong feeling of inferiority and a source of mystification, according to the ascetic ideals created by priests, by the very peculiar genealogical method. Genealogy, as we will see, is not a historical method as such, because Nietzsche is not interested in the chronological or specific aspects of different ages, but rather in a selection of psychological and physiological factors determining the origin of a phenomenon like ressentiment across the whole of human history. In this sense, Nietzsche can describe himself as the first psychologist, or der erste große Psychologe, in the history of philosophy. So, after a very brief examination of the commonest anti-Semitic misunderstandings about Nietzsche's notion of ressentiment, I will also provide an interpretation of this theory in connection with Nietzsche's quarrel against Darwin's evolutionism. More specifically, as we will see, Nietzsche's ressentiment might be considered as the most acute and insidious objection to Darwin's idea of fitness, and at the same time as an attempt to solve one of the hardest of Nietzsche's dilemmas, namely, how could the herd of priests and slaves defeat the overman? We will analyze also the famous passage about lambs and eagles, and we will see that Nietzsche seems to introduce an important difference between evolution in a Darwinian sense and progress. This is the point. Evolution is not the same thing as progress. According to Nietzsche, each person must try to satisfy their self-preservation instinct, not by using treacherous, revengeful, and repressive mechanisms, such as those of ressentiment, to fight other people, but rather by adopting the attitudes of will to power and amor fati. I will explain better afterwards. In other words, the human being has to overcome his human condition by rising to the superior aristocratic status of the overman, Übermensch, also symbolized by Dionysus versus the crucified. Thus, as I will further argue, the theory of ressentiment brings out, by contrast, the virtues of Nietzsche's Übermensch, or Nietzsche's overman, without any requirement for a true, concrete, political or juridical proposal, but with many references to the crucial scientific Darwinian debate of the late 19th century, and also with all the limits and advantages of a magnificent utopia. As you can see, the metaphor of hammer comes from the subtitle of Twilight of Idols, Götzendämmerung. In Nietzsche, because in Nietzsche's world Weltanschauung, the notion of ressentiment represents just one of many examples, maybe the most outstanding or emblematic, of a typical way of using the instrument of psychological inquiry to deconstruct or dismantle long-lasting moral disbeliefs. Even the choice of the French italicized version of these words, as I mentioned, appears significant for several reasons. First of all, The French ressentiment had been perfectly understandable, if not for the ordinary person in the street, for German elite since the 7th century. And as noted by some scholars, this lexical choice should be considered as an expression of a typical German Enlightenment taste for French vogues, obviously an interest, a taste previous to Nietzsche. And at the same time, it was also a way for the author to underline his Europeanist vocation as opposed to the Hegelian tendency to nationalize and Germanize the philosophical lexicon. But the term ressentiment, of which we may detect as many as 67 occurrences in Nietzsche's opera Omnia, is also evidence of this author's well-known preference for French literature. I just mentioned them, the writings of essayists and moralists such as La Rochefoucauld, Montaigne, Flaubert, Stendhal, and many others. So Nietzsche himself reveals in a letter to Franz Overbeck, dated February 21, 1887, and remember, the Genealogy of Morals was to be written the following summer, 1887, a very special, highly valued literary source just discovered a few weeks before. This work, this novel by Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground, as it has been translated in English, was known by Nietzsche as in one of its many different French editions. Nietzsche reads L'Esprit Souterrain, but there was also many other French translations such as Mémoires écrits dans un souterrain, Le sous-sol, Les carnets du sous-sol, Manuscrits du souterrain, etc. And also in the section 45 of Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche wrote that Dostoevsky is the only psychologist, incidentally, from whom I, Nietzsche, had something to learn. He ranks among the most beautiful strokes of fortune in my life. The stroke of fortune is just this discovery, even more than my discovery of Stendhal. Stendhal is one of the older French writers beloved by Nietzsche. So, it is precisely from the description of the main character, Anton Antonovich, from his psychological inclination to frustration and bitterness, that Nietzsche borrows the term ressentiment. And it is no coincidence that Antonovich shows a strong feeling of inferiority and inadequacy towards his fellow men. Indeed, he envies their success, appearance, intelligence, and the behavior arising from such feelings is not so different, as we will see, from the attitude of the priest Nietzsche described in Genealogy of Morals, where we find the most systematic and accomplished treatment of the notion of ressentiment. And it is precisely in this book that the origin of morals is proposed as an out-and-out history of ressentiment, namely as a set of false values devised by a specific social category, the priesta or the priest, as a reaction to a feeling of inferiority towards another group of individuals, the nobles, i.e. the warriors or masters, the Wohlgeratene in German. So, in the first of the three dissertations composing the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche outlines some important elements of ressentiment, illustrating the difference between ordinary resentment and the particular attitude evoked by the French term. So we read in Genealogy of Morals, the slave revolt in morality begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. The ressentiment of natures that are denied the true reaction, that of deeds, and compensate themselves with an imaginary revenge. While every noble morality develops from a triumphant affirmation of itself, slave morality from the outset says no to what is outside, what is different, what is not itself, and this no is its creative deed. This inversion of the value positing I, this need to direct one's view outward instead of back to oneself, is of the essence of ressentiment. In order to exist, slave morality always first needs a hostile external world. It needs, physiologically speaking, external stimuli in order to act at all. Its action is fundamentally reaction. First of all, this passage supports the view mentioned at the beginning that not all cases of resentment can be classified as ressentiment. To have a ressentiment, it is necessary for the people who feel it to have built a true system of values, or rather an episteme, moving from their own emotions. Unlike simple resentment, indeed, ressentiment generates a vision of life, a rigid grid of antinomies, such as good, bad, and right, wrong, and so on. And it is precisely from the wish to challenge these moral categories, perfectly symmetrical to the metaphysical ones, namely from the need to destroy them with a metaphorical hammer, the hammer we've just seen, that Nietzsche starts his analysis of ressentiment as the source that generates these false beliefs. So this no we were reading in the passage, i.e. the denial and repression that resentful people express against vital instincts, will be the perfect counterpart, as we will see, to the overman's values of yes to life and amor fati, intended by Nietzsche as a physiological, non-repressive immersion in the flow of things. Actually, the same word in its English version, resentment, would have appeared much more exotic in a German context than its French variant, and would have had a much more sarcastic tone, evoking the same difference as between the terms genre in French and kind in English, from the point of view of a German reader of this century. On the contrary, the two German variants, Groll and Verstimmung, which also appear in Nietzsche's opus, assume a number of much more non-technical meanings than ressentiment, and are consequently more general and more context-based. In particular, Verstimmung is understood in the wider and global sense of discontent, bad mood, or irritation, while Groll is more literally translated as rancor or hatred. In neither case do we find anyone who gets to build a world, meaning a system of values typical of ressentiment, and such a peculiar, wholly creative reactivity seems to be lacking in the other uses of the term. And that is why resentful people will also be defined as Interweltler, a term that in English is commonly translated with those in backwaters, but actually and literally indicating those who are attached to the rear side of the world. And this is a polysemantic term because Interweltler also is also a synonym of peasants, of rude people. So, according to Nietzsche, the Interweltler have conceived a sort of second world in addition to the real one. So, in order to question the system of values produced by ressentiment and to be able to obtain an Umwertung aller Werte, a transvaluation of all values, Nietzsche's genealogical method, as it is called, implies that moral notions, just like metaphysical or philosophical ones, are not to be considered as absolute or valid entities per se, but on the contrary as the result of historical, physiological, and above all, psychological conditionings. Therefore, unlike the historian, the genealogist does not worry about the chronological succession of single events, nor is he interested in their specific conjectures or other details. He only analyzes general phenomena by selecting particular aspects of them, namely the physiological and psychological dynamics involved. And this orientation is inspired precisely by the the positive materialism deriving from a neo-Kantian background and setting out to explain moral phenomena by analyzing them from a naturalistic point of view, that is, by tracing them back to the physiological drives on which they are grounded. And this approach has to do what Freud would have defined as the economic point of view, the ökonomische Standpunkt, namely the investigation of the intensity of instinctual strengths involved in psychic phenomena. In this sense, in Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche was able to define, as we already told, morals as a symbolic language of the emotions, eine Zeichensprache der Affekte. And this is the reason why Nietzsche was repeatedly and emphatically to underline the crucial value of psychological analysis. We could cite countless aphorisms or passages in Nietzsche's work in which the value of psychological knowledge is emphasized, and the author describes himself as the best specialist in this discipline, and which to some extent suggest that psychology is something of a keystone of his philosophical endeavor. For instance, in Ecce Homo, Nietzsche writes, "What philosopher before me was a psychologist instead of his opposite, a higher Freud, an idealist? Psychology did not exist until I appeared. It can be a curse." Psychology did not exist until I appeared is a question. "It can be a curse to be first here. It is at any rate a destiny, because you are also the first to despise. My danger is disgust with people." And in Beyond Good and Evil, we read, "All psychology," it is a very important and very often cited passage, "all psychology hitherto has run aground on moral prejudices and timidities. It has not dared to launch out into the depths. Nobody had yet harbored the notion of psychology as the morphology and the development doctrine of the will to power. As I conceive of it, the power of moral prejudices has penetrated deeply into the most intellectual world, the world apparently most indifferent and unprejudiced, and has obviously operated in an injurious, obstructive, blinding, and distorting manner. Psychology shall once more be recognized as the queen of the sciences, for whose service and equipment the other sciences exist. For psychology is once more the path to the fundamental problems." These final definitions of psychology as the queen of the sciences and the path to fundamental problems may itself be considered to be a typical case of Nietzsche's Umwertung or transvaluation. Indeed, the expression queen of the sciences, from the Latin regina scientiarum, is exactly the same position of priority that scholastic philosophers attributed to metaphysics. Thus, psychology, instead of metaphysics, implies a reversal of perspectives marked by Nietzsche's usual rhetorical strategy of estrangement. What I mean is that he uses this strategy to emphasize that psychology is the main tool for the deconstruction of metaphysics itself, or the hammer mentioned in The Twilight of Idols, as we have seen. But as we will see, Nietzsche's conception of morals as a symbolic language of emotions is also connected to his attempt to reduce the complexity of values or theoretical and therefore ethical constructions to the basic elementary structure of physiological and biological mechanisms. In other words, Nietzsche prefigures, this is very interesting for contemporary people, because he prefigures the contemporary revaluation of the cognitive role of the emotions, foreseeing their centrality in the intellectual and decisional trials that human beings face. In his opinion, the contiguity between emotions and corporeality is no longer to be understood as a limit or a flaw in comparison to a presumed purity of speculative abstractions, but on the contrary, as a confirmation of the biological and materialistic in Lange's sense. Lange is the main reference of Nietzsche in positivist literature, following in the footsteps of one of his main philosophical influences. As a confirmation of the biological and materialistic paradigm on which Nietzsche's ontology is founded. So, many scholars have argued that the obviously unconscious psychological attitude of people affected by ressentiment could be summarized using the analogy of the famous tale of the fox and the grapes, first narrated by Aesop and then by La Fontaine. In the same way that the fox, whose desire to reach the grapes being frustrated, reacts by despising the quality of the fruit, the priests, and according the slaves, being unable to share the strength and vitality of the vulgar Athena, decide to debase and defame those qualities by creating an alternative and opposite system of values. In this sense, the attitude of resentful people may be considered as reactive, as we told. They try to provide a remedy to a condition of frustration, or rather to a feeling of inferiority. Actually, what specifically characterizes ressentiment is not the simple fact of having suffered unfair treatment. To be resentful, in Nietzsche's sense, it is also necessary to have a feeling of inadequacy. To fully understand Nietzsche's notion of ressentiment as a negative or dysfunctional moral paradigm, namely as a polemical target, and not for nothing a polemical tract is precisely the subtitle of Genealogy of Morals. It will be useful to consider that the positive reference model adopted by Nietzsche by way of contrast. As indicated in the passage quoted in the last paragraph, every noble morality develops from a triumphant affirmation of itself. The model of such aristocratic morals is rooted in Nietzsche's youthful philological past. At the time of his Valedictionsarbeit at Forta, and it is identified with the Greek poets Theognis of Megara Iblea, 6th, 5th century before Christ. And Nietzsche borrows from Theognis the idea of that happiness does not come from the observance of moral rules. Conversely, it is happiness itself that produces ethical rectitude. From an aristocratic perspective, discipline is never imposed from the outside, but it is a natural consequence for a person inspired by a passionate drive towards performance. The features attributed by Nietzsche to the masters, namely to the Wohlgeratene, in Genealogy of Morals, come precisely from this Greek background. They are the nobles or the warriors expressing a natural physical and or intellectual superiority over other social categories. Their habit is to face enemies as a challenge, to manifest their thoughts and desires explicitly, and above all, to live in tune with their own vital instinct. In doing so, they act in the present and tend towards forgetfulness of the past and of wrongs they have suffered. On the contrary, the slaves have the tendency to dwell on negative thoughts and to cultivate silently in themselves a wish to be redeemed. Their slavery is not necessarily the result of a state of economic or social inferiority, as we see, for instance, in the posthumous fragments where Nietzsche mentions slave categories such as the monk, the Prussian officer, and even the scholar, even us in a certain way. Their discontent and their ressentiment are cleverly exploited by a third category, the priests, rightly defined as, in a way, direction changers of ressentiment. Nietzsche writes, the priest alters the direction of ressentiment. The priest, acting in a sneaky, hypocritical way, with an attitude quite similar to that of Molière's Tartuffe, for instance, provide the slaves with an explanation obviously false and deceptive of their suffering by making them feel guilty about their desires. In other words, they build, as we said, a fictitious world in which the vital instincts are denied by the affirmation of antithetical values. For instance, the exaltation of suffering, the so-called holiness, disguised in a positive form. Nietzsche writes, this dominating sense of displeasure is combated first by means that reduce the feeling of life in general to its lowest point. If possible, will and desire are abolished altogether. All that produces effects and blood is avoided, abstinence from salt, the hygienic regimen of the fakirs, no love, no hate, indifference, no revenge, no wealth, no work. One begs, if possible, no women, or as little as possible. In spiritual matters, Pascal's principle, il faut s'abattre, is applied. The result, expressed in moral, psychological terms, is selflessness, sanctification, in physiological terms, hypnotization, the attempt to win for man an approximation to what in certain animals is hibernation. In many tropical plants, estivation, the minimum metabolism at which life will still subsist without really entering consciousness. An astonishing amount of human energy has been expended to this end. Has it been in vain? In the fictitious world built by priests and Christian morals, or in the so-called kingdom of heaven, it is possible to keep the hope of future compensation alive, namely a chance for the slaves to be avenged and rewarded in the end. And this is why Christian morality represents the most resounding and abominable example of ressentiment, and the different prerogatives of nobles and priests can be symbolized by the opposition between Dionysus and the crucified. However, we do ask, how can the priests manage to instill ascetic ideals into slaves? What is the psychological mechanism allowing ressentiment to prevail? In fact, the process works in the same way from both the moral and the metaphysical point of view. In both cases, the real source of our convictions has to be identified in our drives and in our instinctual nature. For these reasons, the following and very famous passage of Twilight of the Idols, in this passage, Nietzsche talks about a causal instinct or a causal drive, the so-called Ursachentriebe. Most of our general feelings, Nietzsche writes, every kind of inhibition, pressure, tension, and explosion in the play and counterplay of our organs, and particularly the states of the nervus sympathicus, excite our causal instinct. We want to have a reason for feeling this way or that, for feeling bad or for feeling good. We are never satisfied merely to state the fact that we feel this way or that. We admit this fact only, become conscious of it only, when we have furnished some kind of motivation. The psychological explanation of this, to derive something unknown from something familiar, relieves, comforts, and satisfies, besides giving a feeling of power. With the unknown, one is confronted with danger, discomfort, and care. The first instinct is to abolish these painful states. That which is new and strange and has not been experienced before is excluded as a cause. Consequence, one kind of positing of causes predominates more and more, is concentrated into a system, and finally emerges as dominant. That is, as simply precluding other causes and explanation. The banker immediately thinks of business, the Christian of sin, and the girl of her love. So we find here the most typical of Nietzsche's criticism of teleology, i.e. of Aristotle's classic causal paradigm. On this view, the connection between cause and effect, Ursache und Wirkung, is the basic of elementary grammar on which every metaphysical architecture is founded, and it is exactly symmetrical to the guilt, penalty, Schuld und Strafe pair that we find on the moral level. In that case, as well as in the passage we have seen, Nietzsche notes a psychological impulse, the causal instinct of drive, the Ursachentriebe, a sort of anxiety, an instinct of fear or self-conservation, fear as the secret instinct of science, as Nietzsche calls it at other times. And in this sense, Nietzsche clearly claimed elsewhere that morals are a symbolic language of the emotions. Instinct is always good. Instinct is never wrong, because even when it deceives the person, even if it is badly oriented, it is always an expression, or almost an ingenious or naive expression of will to power, i.e. the attitude of which each individual aims to preserve and then to assert themselves, to impose themselves, to master in some way or other the mysterious reality around him. So in the will to power, Nietzsche clearly states the subjective compulsion, not to contradict here, is a biological compulsion. The instinct for the utility of inferring as we do infer is part of us. We almost are this instinct. But what naivete to extract from this a proof that we are therewith in possession of a truth in itself. So, just as in physics or other branches of scientific knowledge, Nietzsche believes that psychology works like a sort of double-edged sword, because it is both the language of the mystification and also the language by which we construct our self-deceptions with a perverse use of psychology itself, like that of priests, of metaphysical philosophers. If we preserve ourselves from becoming, if we try to make reality predictable, we are not expressing our will to power in the best way, because we preclude a useful and unprejudiced investigation of reality. And for this reason, according to Nietzsche, people who lack any experience of knowledge of psychology are passive and unwittingly driven by their instincts. I cut a little bit. So to arrive to the conclusion, when sketching the psychological features of people affected by ressentiment, Nietzsche very often underlines their high level of intellectual elaboration and sharp wittedness. Indeed, the author often betrays a sort of admiration for the complex, sophisticated nature of their reaction as compared with the much simpler, less complicated psychology of nobles. And this relationship between weakness and strength should be precisely understood in terms of a struggle for survival in which the inferior species legitimately tries not to be overwhelmed. Framing the problem this way situates the discourse at a naturalistic level very close to that of Darwin's remarks, namely to the theories of the English psychologists collectively cited by Nietzsche. The reference is especially evident in the famous passage concerning the relationship between lambs and birds of prey. We read, "But let us return. The problem of the other origin of the good as conceived by the man of ressentiment, demands its solution. That lambs dislike great birds of prey does not seem strange. Only it gives no ground for reproaching these birds of prey for bearing off little lambs. And if the lambs say among themselves, these birds of prey are evil, and whoever is least like a bird of prey, but rather its opposite, a lamb, would it not be good? There is no reason to find fault with this institution of an ideal, except perhaps that the birds of prey might view it a little ironically and say, we don't dislike them at all, these good little lambs. We even love them. Nothing is more tasty than a tender lamb." In the metaphor under discussion, the lambs, according to Nietzsche, represent the weaker species, while the birds of prey are the stronger species. Obviously, this interpretation has been hardly criticized. This interpretation of weaker species and stronger species, corresponding to, in Nietzsche, to nobles and warriors. Nobles and warriors are the stronger species. The former, namely the weaker, are portrayed with the psychological features typically of priests and slaves, namely the tendency to denigrate the birds of prey by criticizing and stigmatizing their aggressive instinct. Actually, this is an instinct present in every living being engaged in the struggle for survival. Obviously, it is simple. A simple allegorical projection in which the author takes an imaginative example vaguely inspired by animal psychology to illustrate how, in this opinion, ressentiment is almost similar to what Darwin would have considered the fitness and or the adaptation of living beings. In other words, by acting as polished, evolved animals, priests and slaves cleverly try to avoid a direct clash with the stronger species by creating an overtuned system of values and using sideways attacks to fight their enemies. This is why the lambs denigrate the birds of prey, but not vice versa. Leaving the metaphor aside and drawing its ultimate meaning, I have to note that Nietzsche aims here to underline the adaptive value of ressentiment and its successful match with what he thinks might be Darwin's evolutionary paradigm. Of course, there are many interpretations about this. For instance, some people say that Nietzsche confused Darwin's theories with Lamarck's and was a Lamarckian in spite of himself. Of course, we haven't enough time to better explain this, but regardless of the reliability of Nietzsche's version of Darwinism, and since it is not we can't retrace all the complex relationship between Nietzsche and the evolutionary theory in detail now. It is, however, interesting to note that the author of the Genealogy of Morals makes a very apposite, subtle objection to it, because although the man marked by ressentiment appears in fact successful in his struggle for survival, and he defeats his enemies, at least in terms of the assertion of ethical principles, as he builds an anti-vital model of society, his efficient adaptation to the environment cannot nevertheless be considered as the best expression of human nature. Indeed, ressentiment, as I've already noted, with his no to life, humiliates and mortifies each person's instincts and best energies. Therefore, the evolution of the species of its fitness and adaptation are not to be confused, according to Nietzsche, with the progress of humanity. The latter must rather aim for the growth of its own Wille zur Macht, or will to power. In this way, as I mentioned at the beginning, Nietzsche implicitly succeeds in resolving the dilemma about the relationship between the weaker and stronger people, the gregarious and the heroes, or in the last analysis, between the herd, composed by slaves and headed by priests, and the overman, i.e. the ideal model to which the whole of humanity must tend. Thus, for the very reason that evolution is not to be identified with progress, it is possible that the herd and the ressentiment prevail in the history of humanity. However, if the slave's victory is a matter of fact, man can and must rise to higher values. Man's future is a sunset and is going beyond. The fitting anthropological model, namely individual self-affirmation, must be oriented in the opposite direction to that of ressentiment. As I remarked already, the survival instinct in itself, like any instinct, is never wrong. People who act according to it may make mistakes, but these mistakes are not to be ascribed to the instinct in itself, but rather to their dealing with it in the wrong way. In other words, to an action oriented to a no rather than a yes to life. Contrary to what might be assumed, Nietzsche absolutely does not advocate an anti-democratic individualism or violent ill-treatment of the weak by the strong. It is very important to underline this. As we noted while discussing theognis and aristocratic morals, the overman acts according to superior values and draws his graceful way of relating to others from his happiness. He is happy, so he is moral. The main feature of the overman is a utopian aspiration based on the values of the mythical past of Greek tragedy, but not identified with the concrete, with any concrete political project or positive legal order. Nietzsche himself mentions the various historical recurrence, namely the alternation between eras such as the Renaissance or Napoleon's ascent, marked by the primacy of aristocratic morals and other ages, for instance, the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, in which the paradigm of ressentiment prevailed. Therefore, neither a particular age, nor a legal system, nor least at all a race, is better able than others to embody the model of nobility, that is to say, the model of the overman. And in particular, I try to be very quick, we must reject and deny all interpretations aiming to find support for anti-Semitic leanings in Nietzsche's theory of ressentiment, because the notion that Nietzsche was pro-Nazi, pro-Aryan, and anti-Semitic is fully disproven, as you know, beyond all doubt by several passages of his writings. First of all, in a letter dated June 5, 1887, and written to his sister, Elizabeth Forster, Nietzsche clearly states that any German person claiming any superiority over a Jew should, for that very reason, be considered a buffoon, if not an utter madman. And in addition to his own general disgust for the anti-Semites, voiced, for instance, in another letter to Theodor Frisch, dated 1887, Nietzsche is inclined to place Jews and Germans on the same footing because of their common tendency to ressentiment. And he even thinks that in his day, ressentiment is primarily a feature of the anarchists and the anti-Semites. Last slide. Thus, Nietzsche is not intending to propose a tyrannical or anti-democratic project as an alternative to ressentiment, but rather he wants to underline the potential inherent in human beings, their capacity to emancipate themselves from their human-to-human instincts by endeavoring to rise to the status of overman. In the rest of Nietzsche's work, the overman's alternatives to ressentiment will therefore consist, at times, in heroic individualism, and at other times in the artistic and creative life, and especially in rejecting moral and metaphysical false certainties, plunging into the flow of becoming, and exploring the contradiction and eternal conflict or polemos between interpretations. Thank you for your attention.